The call came 3 days after my father's funeral. My stepmother Karen's voice sickeningly sweet through the phone saying I needed to come by the house to pick up my things, that she was cleaning out what she called dead weight, and I had until Friday to collect anything I wanted before it all went to donation. And when I asked what she meant by my things, she laughed that brittle performative laugh she'd perfected over her 3 years of marriage to my father, and said everything in your old bedroom. All those dusty boxes of your childhood that your father kept for sentimental reasons that no longer apply. And the way she said it made my stomach turn, because my father had been dead 72 hours, and she was already erasing me from the house I'd grown up in. The house my mother had decorated before cancer took her when I was 16. The house that held every memory of my real family before Karen had inserted herself into our lives with her practiced grief over her own supposedly tragic past, and her performance of being exactly what my lonely father needed. I drove to the house that afternoon even though everything in me wanted to stay away, wanted to let her have her petty victory of throwing out my childhood belongings. But there were things in that house that mattered, photos of my mother that my father had kept, jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, things that had actual value beyond sentiment, and I wasn't going to let Karen's cruelty extend to erasing my mother's memory, along with my own. So I pulled into the driveway of the house where I'd lived for 23 years before college took me across the country, and I'd only visited sporadically since, each visit more tense than the last as Karen made it clear I was an interloper in what she considered her domain now. Karen answered the door wearing my mother's pearls. I noticed immediately, the ones my father had given my mother on their 10th anniversary, the ones I'd asked about after the funeral and Karen had claimed she didn't know where they were, and seeing them around her neck made me want to rip them off, but I forced myself to stay calm, forced myself to walk past her into the house that smelled different now. Smelled like Karen's overwhelming perfume instead of my father's coffee and my mother's lavender sachets that used to be everywhere. And Karen led me upstairs to my old bedroom, which she'd clearly already been through. Boxes stacked haphazardly, things thrown into garbage bags without care, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "You have 2 hours. I'm having people come look at the house tomorrow, and I need this room cleared." And I said, "People coming to look at the house? You're selling it." And she smiled that cold smile and said, "Of course I'm selling it. This house is far too large for one person, and I'm moving somewhere more suitable, somewhere that doesn't have quite so many ghosts." I wanted to ask her about my father's will, about what arrangements he'd made, but something stopped me, some instinct that said showing my hand too early would be a mistake. So I just started going through boxes, while Karen watched from the doorway making occasional comments about how much junk my father had kept, how he'd been too sentimental, how she was glad to finally clear out all this dead weight and start fresh, and each comment was designed to hurt me. Designed to make me understand that I had no place in her new life, that my father's death had severed any obligation she felt to pretend to tolerate me. I found my mother's jewelry box buried under old school papers, and when I picked it up, Karen said, "Oh, your father gave that to me. It's mine now. Everything in this house is mine." And I said this was my mother's, my grandmother's before that. And she said, "Well, your mother is dead, and your father is dead, and I'm alive, and it belongs to me. Legally, everything in this house became mine the moment your father died." And the casual cruelty of it, the way she was enjoying this, made me realize this wasn't just about clearing out a bedroom. This was about establishing dominance, about making sure I knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of her new world. I took the jewelry box anyway, held it against my chest, and said, "I'm taking this." And Karen laughed and said, "Go ahead. Take whatever you want. You'll find out soon enough that none of it matters." And there was something in her tone that made me pause, but she just turned and walked away, left me alone in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life that felt increasingly distant. And I packed what I could fit in my car, photos and books and small items that held meaning. And I left without saying goodbye to Karen, who I could hear downstairs on the phone with someone talking about paint colors and staging, already remaking my father's house into something unrecognizable. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at my father's attorney's office, Martin Chen, a man who'd been my father's friend for 30 years and who'd handled all his legal matters. And I arrived early and sat in the waiting room feeling anxious, because I didn't know what to expect. My father and I had been close when I was younger, but the distance of the past few years, both geographical and emotional thanks to Karen's interference, meant I didn't know what his final wishes had been. Didn't know if he'd provided for me, or if Karen's confidence about owning everything was justified. Karen arrived exactly on time, wearing all black like she was still in mourning, even though I'd heard from my father's assistant that she'd been out to dinner 3 times already, with a man nobody recognized. And she didn't acknowledge me, just signed in with the receptionist and sat as far from me as possible. And when Martin's assistant called us in, Karen stood immediately and walked past me like I was invisible, and I followed feeling like I was walking into an execution. Martin's office was exactly as I remembered from the few times my father had brought me here as a child: dark wood and leather, and walls lined with law books. And Martin himself looked tired, looked older than the last time I'd seen him at my father's funeral, where he'd hugged me and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Victoria. Your father loved you very much." And I'd wondered at the time why he'd felt the need to emphasize that, why it seemed like he was trying to tell me something more than just condolences. We sat down, Karen in the chair closest to Martin's desk, me in the chair near the window, and Martin opened a folder and said, "Before we begin, I need to explain that your father updated his will 6 months ago. He came to me with very specific instructions." And Karen smiled, actually smiled, and I felt my stomach drop because I thought I knew what was coming, thought my father had cut me out, had left everything to his wife of 3 years like Karen kept implying. And Martin started reading, and his voice was formal, detached, the way lawyers sound when they're reading legal documents. And he read through the standard opening language, and then got to the specific bequests. And he said I leave my house located at 2847 Riverside Drive to my wife, Karen Patterson, for her use during her natural life. And Karen actually sighed with satisfaction, and Martin continued. "However, upon her death or upon her vacation of the property, whichever comes first, the house shall revert to my daughter Victoria Chen in full ownership." And Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she still looked smug. And Martin kept reading. "I leave my stock portfolio valued at approximately $800,000 to my daughter Victoria Chen. I leave my retirement accounts totaling approximately $1.2 million to my daughter Victoria Chen. I leave my collection of rare books valued at approximately $200,000 to my daughter Victoria Chen." And Karen's face was changing now, was going from smug to confused to angry, and Martin continued reading. "I leave my wife Karen Patterson the sum of $1 and my wedding ring." And the room went silent. Karen stood up so fast her chair fell backwards, and she said, "That's not possible. He wouldn't. We were married, I'm his wife." And Martin said, "Please sit down, Mrs. Patterson. There's more." And Karen said, "I'll contest this. This is fraud. He wasn't in his right mind." And Martin's expression didn't change, but his voice got colder, and he said, "Your husband was in perfect mental health when he updated this will. I have documentation from 2 separate physicians confirming his capacity. And I have video of him signing the will where he explains very clearly his reasoning. Would you like to see it?" And Karen's face went pale, and she sat back down slowly, and Martin turned his computer screen toward us and pressed play. My father's face filled the screen. He looked tired but alert. Sitting in this same office 6 months ago, and he looked directly at the camera and said, "I'm making this video to ensure there's no confusion about my wishes. I've been married to Karen Patterson for 3 years, and in that time, I've come to understand that her interest in me was primarily financial. I've watched her isolate my daughter from my life. I've watched her spend money extravagantly while claiming to be concerned about our security. And I've recently discovered evidence that she's been having an affair with a man named Derek Morrison for the past 18 months. And Karen made a sound like she'd been punched, and my father continued. "I have photographic evidence. I have text messages. I have bank statements showing I've been funding her affair without knowing it. And I've decided that, while I don't have the strength to divorce her while I'm alive, I can at least ensure that she doesn't profit from my death the way she's clearly been planning. So I'm leaving her $1, the legal minimum to prove I didn't forget her. And I'm leaving everything else to my daughter Victoria, who I've neglected these past few years, because I was afraid of Karen's reactions, afraid of the arguments, afraid of being alone. And I'm sorry, Victoria. I'm so sorry I chose comfort over courage. I hope you can forgive me. And the video ended and the office was completely silent. Martin turned the screen back and pulled out another folder and said, "Mr. Chen also asked me to give you this, Victoria." And he handed me a thick envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. And then he turned to Karen and said, "Mrs. Patterson, you have 2 weeks to vacate the property at 2847 Riverside Drive, after which ownership transfers fully to Victoria Chen." And Karen said, "You can't do this. I live there." And Martin said, "Actually, I can and I am." The will is very clear. You were given life estate with the condition of continued residence. But Mr. Chen included a clause that if at any point you attempt to contest the will, or if evidence emerges of fraud or abuse toward his daughter, you forfeit the life estate immediately. And I have evidence. And he pulled out a thick folder and said, "Victoria came to me 1 week ago with documentation that you've been attempting to sell the house. That you've been liquidating Mr. Chen's personal property without authorization, and that you've been harassing Victoria in violation of the will's terms. So as of now, you have forfeited any rights to the property, and you need to vacate immediately." Karen looked at me and her face was twisted with rage, and she said, "You bitch, you planned this." And I said, "No. You planned your own downfall by being exactly the person my father suspected you were, by trying to sell his house before he was cold in the ground, by stealing my mother's jewelry, by erasing me from his life. All I did was document what you were already doing." And Martin said, "Mrs. Patterson, if you don't leave this office immediately, I'll call security." And Karen grabbed her purse and stormed out. And the door slammed behind her, and I sat there shaking. Martin waited until we heard the outer door slam, and then his professional demeanor cracked and he smiled and said, "Your father would be very proud of you, Victoria. He worried you'd be too kind, too willing to let Karen take what she wanted to avoid conflict, but you fought back." And I said I almost didn't. I almost just let her have everything because fighting seemed too hard. And Martin said, "But you didn't. You called me when she started selling things. You documented her violations. And that gave me the legal foundation to accelerate the estate transfer. And now, instead of waiting years for probate, while Karen lived in your father's house spending your inheritance, you have immediate access to everything your father wanted you to have." He walked me through the practical details, how the accounts would transfer, how quickly I could take possession of the house, what I needed to do about taxes and insurance. And through all of it, I kept touching the envelope my father had left me. And finally, when Martin was done with the legal explanations, he said, "You can read that here if you want privacy, or take it home, whatever feels right." And I said, "I'll read it here." And I opened the envelope carefully, and inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. Pages and pages, and I started reading and tears came immediately. The letter began, "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're dealing with Karen's true nature without my interference. And I'm so sorry I put you in this position. I'm sorry I was too weak to end my marriage while I was alive. I'm sorry I let her drive a wedge between us. I'm sorry for every missed call and canceled visit and holiday where I chose her comfort over your presence. And I want you to know that I knew what I was doing. I knew I was choosing wrong. And I hated myself for it, but I couldn't seem to stop. Grief makes you stupid, Victoria. It makes you grab onto anything that feels like life even when it's actually poison. And Karen felt like life after your mother died. She was there, and she was present, and she said the right things. And by the time I realized she was performing love instead of feeling it, I was already married and already tangled up in her manipulations. He wrote about discovering the affair, about hearing a private investigator, about finding out Karen had been planning to leave him for Derek, but had decided to wait until he died naturally so she could inherit everything. About conversations she'd had with Derek that the investigator had recorded where she'd talked about me with such venom it had broken his heart, calling me spoiled and entitled and an obstacle to her plans. And my father wrote, "I knew then that I had to protect you. Had to make sure she couldn't hurt you after I was gone. So I changed the will and I documented everything, and I made sure Martin had ironclad evidence of her true character. And I know this is a terrible burden to place on you. I know having to fight Karen for your inheritance is the last thing you need while you're grieving. But I also know you're stronger than I was, braver than I was, and you won't let her win." The letter went on for pages, memories of my childhood, apologies for the distance of recent years, explanations of financial decisions he'd made that I'd never understood. And near the end he wrote, "I left you more than money, Victoria. I left you the house because it's your mother's house. It's where she lived and loved and raised you. And I couldn't stand the thought of Karen selling it to strangers. Couldn't stand the thought of your mother's memory being erased so thoroughly. So please, if nothing else, keep the house. Live in it, fill it with your own family someday. Make it alive again the way it was before cancer and grief. And my own weakness killed the joy there. And I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too cowardly to show it. Even when I let Karen's poison make me choose silence over your presence. I loved you. And I'm so proud of the woman you've become. And I hope someday you can forgive me for being less than the father you deserved. I finished reading and I was sobbing. And Martin handed me tissues and said your father came in here 6 months ago and he was different. He was determined. He'd spent years being passive and letting Karen control everything. And suddenly he was making decisions, taking action. And he told me he'd woken up one morning and realized he was probably going to die relatively soon. His heart wasn't good and he could feel his body failing. And he decided that he wasn't going to die as Karen's puppet. He was going to die as your father. And everything he did in those last 6 months was about making sure you were protected and provided for. And that's something to hold on to, Victoria. In the end, he chose you. I left Martin's office with my father's letter and a folder full of legal documents that proved I now owned almost everything my father had built in his life. And I drove to the house on Riverside Drive and parked in the driveway and just sat there looking at it. This house that held every memory of my childhood, every ghost of my mother, every moment of the life we'd had before cancer and Karen and grief had dismantled it all. And I knew I was going to fight for it, going to make Karen leave. Going to reclaim this space and fill it with life again the way my father had wanted. I called Martin from the car and said, what do I do if she refuses to leave? And he said, I've already filed the eviction paperwork. The sheriff will serve her tomorrow. She has 72 hours to vacate or she'll be physically removed. And I said, what if she destroys things? What if she damages the house out of spite? And Martin said, I've also filed for a restraining order and an order of protection for the property. If she damages anything, she'll face criminal charges. Your father anticipated her potential reactions, and we've prepared for all of them. You're protected, Victoria, legally and practically, and all you have to do is wait her out. The waiting was harder than I'd expected, those 72 hours while Karen was still in the house. While I didn't know what she was doing in there, whether she was destroying my mother's things or stealing what she could before the sheriff forced her out. And I parked down the street several times and watched the house, saw movers coming and going, saw Karen directing them with angry gestures. And I wanted to go in and stop her, but Martin said let her take her own belongings. Let her remove anything she brought into the marriage. We don't want to give her any ammunition to claim you're stealing from her. And so I watched and waited and counted down the hours until the house would be mine again. On the third day, the sheriff arrived at 9 in the morning, and I watched from my car as they knocked on the door and Karen answered, and they handed her papers, and she screamed at them, actually screamed. And neighbors came out to watch, and Karen's humiliation was public and complete. And the sheriff gave her 2 hours to finish packing and be gone or they'd remove her by force. And she slammed the door, and I saw her through the windows moving frantically, throwing things into boxes. And exactly 2 hours later, she emerged with a U-Haul truck full of her belongings, and she got in her car and drove away without looking back. And the sheriff called me and said the property is clear, it's yours. And I drove up to the house and used my old key that somehow still worked, and I walked inside my childhood home for the first time in 3 years. The house was a disaster. Karen had taken artwork off the walls, leaving bright squares where the paint hadn't faded. She'd taken furniture that had belonged to my mother, claiming it was hers. She'd cleared out kitchen items and linens and anything portable enough to throw in a truck. And the house felt violated, felt ransacked. But it also felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in years because Karen's overwhelming presence was gone. Her perfume was fading. Her energy was dissipating. And I walked through each room, taking inventory of the damage and making lists of what needed to be replaced or repaired. And when I got to my old bedroom, I found she'd left it completely empty, had taken even the boxes I'd packed of my own belongings. And I understood it was her final petty cruelty, her way of trying to hurt me even as she lost everything else. But I didn't care about the stuff. I cared about the house itself, about the walls that held my mother's memory, about the space I could now reclaim and restore. I spent the next 2 weeks cleaning, repairing, slowly returning the house to something that felt like home instead of Karen's stage set. And I found things she'd hidden. Jewelry she'd stashed in air vents planning to come back for it. Cash in envelopes taped under drawers. Evidence of her theft that I documented and sent to Martin, who added it to the case he was building. Because apparently Karen had decided to contest the will despite the video evidence, despite the documentation of her affair. Despite everything, she'd hired a lawyer and was claiming my father had been coerced into changing the will, that I'd manipulated him, that he'd been mentally incompetent, all the standard arguments people make when they're caught being exactly who they are. Martin said, "Don't worry, we have overwhelming evidence. She won't win, but she'll make noise for a while," and I said I don't care. She can make all the noise she wants. She's not getting this house. She's not getting my father's money. She's not getting anything except what she deserves, which is public exposure of who she really is. The court case took 3 months, and I sat through every hearing watching Karen perform for the judge, watching her cry on cue and claim she'd loved my father, watching her paint me as the evil daughter who'd alienated my father and stolen his estate. And her lawyer tried every trick, tried to get my father's video testimony thrown out, tried to claim the affair evidence was fabricated, tried to argue that my father's mental competence was questionable despite 2 doctors' evaluations. And through it all, Martin was methodical and thorough, presenting document after document, bringing in witnesses who testified to Karen's behavior, playing recordings the private investigator had made, building a case so overwhelming that even Karen's lawyer looked embarrassed. And finally, the judge ruled from the bench, said Mr. Chen's will is valid. His mental competence is clearly established, and Mrs. Patterson's claims are without merit. The estate will be distributed according to the will's specifications. Case closed, and Karen's face went red with rage, and she actually had to be escorted from the courtroom by bailiffs after she started screaming at the judge. And I sat there feeling vindicated and exhausted and grateful that my father had known exactly what he was doing, had protected me so thoroughly that even Karen's best efforts couldn't overcome his planning. Karen tried one more time, showed up at the house 6 months later claiming she'd left personal items and demanding to be let in. And I called the police and they came and explained to her that she was trespassing, that she'd forfeited all rights to the property, and that if she returned she'd be arrested. And she left screaming about lawsuits and revenge. And I never saw her again, heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd married Derek within a year and they'd moved out of state. And I hoped she was Derek's problem now, and no longer mine. I lived in the house for a year by myself, slowly restoring it, bringing back my mother's touches, hanging photos my father had kept in storage, filling the rooms with life and light. And I thought about my father's letter constantly, about his hope that I'd forgive him, about his wish that I'd fill the house with family someday. And I decided I would, decided I'd honor his memory by building the life here that Karen had tried to steal. And when I met my now husband James at a gallery opening 2 years after my father's death, and he asked where I lived and I told him about the house and its history, he said it sounds like a house with a story. And I said it's a house with a lot of stories, but it's my house now, my story now, and that's what matters. We got married 3 years after my father's death, and I wore my mother's pearls, the ones Karen had stolen and I'd taken back, the ones my father had given my mother on their 10th anniversary. And during the ceremony, I looked at James and thought about my father's letter, about how he'd chosen Karen out of grief and fear of being alone, and how that choice had nearly cost him everything that mattered. And I thought about how I was choosing James out of love and certainty, and the knowledge that we were building something real, and the difference felt important, felt like the lesson my father had died trying to teach me. We lived in the house and filled it with life the way he'd wanted, had 2 children who ran through the same halls I'd run through as a child, who played in the same backyard where my mother had planted roses, who grew up knowing they were part of a family story that included grief and betrayal, but also love and resilience, and the victory of fighting for what matters. And sometimes when the house was quiet and I was alone in my father's old office reading or working, I'd feel his presence, feel his approval, feel him watching over the family he'd protected even from the grave. And I'd whisper, thank you for being brave enough to change the will. Thank you for trusting me to fight. Thank you for giving me back the house and the life that Karen tried to steal. And I'd like to think he heard me, wherever he was, and knew that his final act of courage had mattered, had protected his daughter, had given me the foundation to build a life that honored both him and my mother. Karen sent a card when she heard I'd gotten married. No return address. Just a card with a generic congratulations message and a handwritten note that said, "I hope you're happy in that drafty old house with all its ghosts." And I laughed when I read it because she still didn't understand. Didn't understand that the ghosts were the point, that the memories were the treasure, that the house was never about square footage or property value. It was about continuity and love, and refusing to let her erase my family's story. And I threw the card away and went back to planning my daughter's 3rd birthday party, the one we'd have in the backyard where my mother's roses were blooming, where my father had pushed me on a swing 30 years ago, where my family's story continued despite Karen's best efforts to write us all out of existence. My father's estate attorney, Martin, became a family friend, came to birthday parties and holidays, and one Christmas when he'd had enough wine to be sentimental, he told me, "Your father came to see me a week before he died. He said he wanted to make sure I understood how important it was that you got the house, that you kept it in the family." And I asked him why the house mattered so much when the money was what most people would care about. And your father said Victoria was raised in love in that house. Her mother died in that house. Their family lived in that house. And Karen wanted to erase all of that, wanted to sell it and pocket the money and pretend none of us had ever existed there. And I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let our family's last physical manifestation be wiped away for cash. So the house had to go to Victoria, had to stay in the family, had to remain ours. And Martin said your father died knowing he'd protected what mattered. And that's not nothing, Victoria, that's everything. I think about that conversation often, about my father's final act of love being not just the money or the legal protection, but the specific insistence that I keep the house, that I maintain the physical space where our family had existed. And I understand now that he was giving me more than real estate. He was giving me roots, was giving me the permanent refutation of Karen's claim that I didn't matter, that I could be erased, that my family's story could be overwritten with hers. And the house stands as proof that you can't erase love, can't sell memory, can't demolish family history with a contract and some manipulation. And every time I walk through the front door, I think about my father's video, about him sitting in Martin's office explaining his reasoning, about him being brave enough to name Karen's betrayal, about him choosing truth over comfort in his final months. And I try to live with that same courage, to choose hard truths over easy lies, to protect what matters, even when protecting it costs something. Karen's attempt to steal my inheritance became a story I told at dinner parties, became a cautionary tale about grief and manipulation and the importance of protecting yourself legally. And people would listen with wide eyes and say, "I can't believe she tried to take everything. I can't believe your father knew and planned around her. I can't believe you fought back instead of just letting her have it." And I'd say I almost didn't fight, almost let her win because fighting seemed too hard. But then I read my father's letter and understood that he'd already fought for me, had already laid the groundwork, and all I had to do was trust his planning and refuse to surrender. And they'd nod and say, "You're brave," and I'd say no, my father was brave. I just honored his bravery by not wasting it. My daughter is 7 now and asks questions about the house, about why it's important to me, about who lived here before, and I tell her age-appropriate versions of the story. Tell her about her grandmother who loved roses, about her grandfather who was an architect and designed the sunroom, about the evil stepmother who tried to steal it all but couldn't because her grandfather was smarter than the evil stepmother expected. And my daughter listens like it's a fairy tale, like it's a story that happened once upon a time to characters instead of to real people she's related to. And maybe that's healthy. Maybe that's the right amount of distance. Maybe the next generation should inherit the house and the security it represents without inheriting the trauma and betrayal that almost cost us everything. I updated my own will last year, made sure that the house is protected not just for my children, but for their children, established a trust that prevents anyone from selling it without unanimous agreement of all descendants, built in the legal protections that ensure Karen, or someone like Karen, can never again threaten the family home. And my lawyer said this is unusually restrictive, Most people want flexibility, and I said I don't want flexibility. I want protection. I want to make sure that what my father fought to preserve stays preserved. And she nodded and drew up the documents, and now the house is legally protected for generations. And that feels right. Feels like honoring my father's final wishes by extending his vision forward. Sometimes I wonder what Karen is doing now, whether she thinks about the house and the money she almost had, whether she regrets being so obvious in her greed that my father noticed and documented it, whether she's learned anything from losing everything she'd schemed for. And then I stop wondering because Karen isn't my story anymore. She's just a chapter that ended. Just the obstacle my father and I overcame together, even though he had to do his part from beyond the grave. And the real story is about the house and the family and the love that turned out to be stronger than manipulation. And that's the story I want to tell. The one I want my children to inherit. The one that turns grief and betrayal into resilience and victory. And that story is still being written every day I wake up in this house. Every meal I cook in this kitchen. Every night I put my children to bed in rooms that once held my own childhood dreams. And the story will continue long after I'm gone. Will continue through my children and their children. Will continue because my father was brave enough to change a will and smart enough to document his reasoning and loving enough to protect his daughter even from the grave. And I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that protection, being brave enough to fight for what he gave me, being smart enough to protect it for the next generation, being loving enough to make sure this house remains what it's always been, a home for our family. A monument to love stronger than death. A physical manifestation of the truth that you can't erase people who refuse to be erased. You can't steal from people who know their own value. And you can't win against someone who's already lost everything that matters and decided that what remains is worth fighting for. And my father lost my mother to cancer and almost lost himself to Karen's manipulation. But in the end, he found his courage and fought for me. And I found mine and fought for the house. And now we've won, finally, permanently, completely. And Karen is wherever she is, probably still bitter about it, probably still telling people she was robbed, probably still playing the victim, and I don't care. I genuinely don't care what narrative she's constructed to make herself feel better, because I have the house and the money and the family and the future, and she has whatever Derek is willing to put up with, and whatever lies she needs to tell herself to sleep at night, and that's not my problem. That's not my story. That's just the noise that happens in the background while the real story unfolds. And the real story is about a father who loved his daughter enough to protect her from beyond the grave. About a daughter who loved her father enough to honor his protection by fighting for what he'd given her. And about a house that stands as physical proof that love and planning and courage can defeat manipulation and greed. And that's the story I tell myself every time I walk through my front door. Every time I sit in my mother's garden. Every time I stand in my father's office and remember the man who was too weak to leave Karen, while he lived but strong enough to destroy her plans in death. And that story is mine now, is my family's now, is protected in trust documents and property deeds and the memories we make here. And Karen can't touch it, can't taint it, can't steal it no matter what she tried or what she'll try in the future. And that victory, that permanent, unassailable victory, is my father's final gift to me. Is the inheritance that matters more than money or property. Is the knowledge that I come from people who fight for each other, who protect each other, who refuse to let manipulation and cruelty win. And I will pass that knowledge to my children. Will teach them that sometimes the people who should love you will betray you. But sometimes the people who truly love you will protect you even from the grave. And the difference between those two types of love is everything, is the whole story. Is the lesson written into every wall of this house that Karen tried to steal, and my father made sure I kept.